very sorry I couldn't make it in person. Okay, so then this is a paper co-authored with Jing who is a master's student actually at Columbia University. So he's applying for PhDs this cycle, and it's called Competition in the Market for Crypto Exchanges. So this is not exactly a DeFi paper per se. This is a paper about crypto exchanges, right? Which you know as the onboard, offboard ramps for crypto, right? So essentially, say I want to buy some Bitcoin or Ethereum or Maker or something like that. I take my bank account, I send a bank transfer to Coinbase, and then essentially sort of I could, if I'm not in the US, go to Binance. If I'm in the US, I could go to Coinbase. And kind of a stylized fact we start with is that there are a very large number of crypto exchanges, right? So Binance offers you the service of buying a bunch of cryptos. Coinbase offers you the service of doing the same thing. Huobi, Bybit, and so on do the same thing. And I highlight that the market structure of crypto exchanges is kind of interesting because of the fact that you have a very large number of exchanges, right? And while the largest exchanges are quite big, you have a very, very long tail of smaller exchanges, right? So here's a ranking roughly. We have Binance, Coinbase, KuCoin, Gemini, Huobi, so on and so on and so forth, right? And kind of the funny thing is that sort of unlike settings in traditional finance, where it tends to be that you have one or a few exchanges trading basically sort of traditional financial assets, there are like meaningfully two or three cryptocurrencies which have large market share. And you have hundreds of exchanges trading three cryptocurrencies, right? And so we first highlight that this is a very strange market structure from a traditional finance perspective, right? You might ask basically like everyone wants to trade Bitcoin. Why is it that you have so many different exchanges for people to trade Bitcoin, right? And then so we ask a number of questions. Basically, we want to write a paper understanding crypto exchange market structure. And then in the paper, we want to ask, why is crypto exchange market structure so fragmented? If exchanges compete for basically what looks like a meaningfully fixed volume of trade, why isn't it the case that big exchanges just absorb smaller ones? Or basically customers move from the small exchanges to the big exchanges because of the fact that there's more liquidity, right? And the funny thing is basically, given there's such a large proliferation of crypto exchanges, another question you can ask is, do we care about market power? There are a couple of big exchanges, basically that sort of, the market power of the largest exchanges is relatively bounded, right? So we're going to start this paper with a kind of straw man hypothesis that we're not going to knock down, right? You might think first of the crypto exchange market, like, for example, the market for yogurt in the US, right? And the yogurt market basically has a couple players, and the idea is that like one brand of yogurt is the substitute for another brand. And so the basic economics of IO and market structure imply that we should observe certain things when you have like products which are substitutes, right? So imagine like grocery stores, right? You have a small town and then you have some grocery stores, and then a giant exchange says, or a giant like Walmart opens a grocery store. What should happen is that the entry of large players in the market should cannibalize small players' market share, right? People should go to Walmart and people don't go to the local grocery store instead. And what we should see is that the small grocery stores lose market share to the big grocery stores. If exchanges work like grocery stores, Binance listing a token should tend to steal trade volume from small exchanges, right? And what we should observe is Binance's listing should cause small exchanges' trade volume to decrease. Small exchanges should know this. And what the small exchange should see when Binance enters is basically that knowing that they have less trade volume, they should be more likely to exit, right? Now, as a DeFi audience, you probably know that the opposite happens. Large and small exchanges don't appear to be substitutes. Instead, they appear to be complements. What happens is that when large exchanges list a token, trading volume on the small exchanges, far from being cannibalized, instead actually increases on the small exchanges. And then small exchanges seem to know this. When Binance lists a coin, the small exchange becomes more likely to list the coin, right? And then a kind of like hint as to what's going on is that when the large exchange lists, price dispersion across exchanges decreases. So in a sense, we want to kind of draw a link from this stylized fact, which is at least colloquially known in the DeFi literature and to DeFi market participants, to classic theory, which highlights that relative to a simple IO model of exchange competition, this is a strange thing to observe. And the question is basically like substitutes, like competitors competing for a fixed market share. And so we're going to write down a model that explains why we see this. And the model is the following. We're going to assume basically two core components. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
But I if I go to your example about the yogurt, so I feel like something that is a little bit different is that even that they sell the same good, the requirements to use any exchange can be different. So sometimes could be a case that if I am in South Africa, I can only trade with the local exchange market, and I can't really be a Coinbase customer, right?
Exactly. So then this is the first core component of our model. So you guessed it exactly right.
Okay.
That the exchanges from a customer's perspective are substitutes, but they're very imperfect substitutes. They're imperfect substitutes essentially because there's a large number of customers who are more or less for some reason captive to some exchanges. And you've given exactly one of the core reasons, which is that exchanges specialize in the action of basically allowing people to trade fiat for crypto. The crypto leg is the same for every exchange. The fiat leg is different. If I want to allow someone to trade currency in Australia or New Zealand or Indonesia or somewhere for crypto, I need to have a bank account which allows the customer to send a bank transfer. And in doing that, basically, I need an Indonesian bank. And to do that, I need to play well with Indonesian regulators, with their KYC requirements, with various other things. So what this means is that exchanges have naturally captive customer bases due to, first of all, the fact that regulation implies that being an exchange in a given country requires country-specific costs. Second of all, that exchanges may target different customer bases through advertising, through we play nicely with regulators, and some exchanges may not play so nicely, allowing like sort of less KYC and things like that. So exchanges have a natural kind of shield from their customers going to other exchanges through captive customer bases. So this element alone could predict why Binance doesn't cannibalize small exchanges when it enters, but doesn't explain why we find the opposite effect of Binance basically when they enter increasing volumes and having the exchanges follow. And of course, the second element is that on the fiat side, on the customer side, we assume these side. It does not make sense for the customers of, say, Australia to trade only among themselves. Because what happens if Australia wants to buy Bitcoin on the whole? What happens if Australia wants to sell Bitcoin on the whole? They have to find someone to buy from. In a situation where Australia is an isolated exchange, demand shocks which are positive in Australia cause prices to go up but do not move volume. But of course, this creates an incentive for an arbitrator to specialize, to say, I'm going to open a bank account in Australia, I'm going to open a bank account somewhere else, and I'm going to be able to buy crypto on Binance, send it to Australia, and sell it to respond to the demand shocks in Australia. So the second core component is that we assume these exchanges who specialize in having captive customer bases are connected in the global crypto market through arbitrageurs who essentially buy and sell crypto at the deep core exchanges and connect them via arbitrage to the peripheral exchanges with captive customer bases. So how does this explain the facts we observe? It's very simple. What happens is that if an Australian exchange lists a small token like Maker, right? Without Binance listing, liquidity is not as deep. The small exchange can only trade when there's idiosyncratic shocks. When Binance lists a large token, then Australia has access to the global liquidity for Maker token because they can go through Binance, arbitrage linked to Binance. This explains number one, why trade volumes increase, and then number two, why the exchange, knowing that trade volume is higher, is going to be more likely to list the token. And we're going to validate the predictions empirically. So what the picture we want to paint, Nir, as you pointed out, is essentially this picture that, so we started with the question, why are there so many crypto exchanges? And our answer is essentially that the crypto exchange in the crypto market functions not so much as an exchange like Robinhood, or not so much as an exchange, but more like a broker. The crypto exchange specializes in figuring out the fiat and regulatory rails of a particular country. It is a naturally differentiated task because doing the regulatory rails in one country does not make you better, and in some ways may perhaps make you worse at doing it in other countries. Binance does not want to figure out and cooperate with the regulators of every country, leaving an opportunity for small exchanges in each country to basically figure out how do we work well with the regulators and the banks, and then offer basically crypto buying services to the customers in their country. But essentially, these exchanges can do better than simply letting the Indian crypto market trade with other Indians who want to buy crypto, of course. In order to connect them to the global crypto market, what happens is naturally arbitrages emerge, linking exchanges to each other and allowing the global crypto, allowing liquidity from Binance to flow to these small exchanges. And so essentially the picture we paint is that you have a network essentially of small peripheral exchanges which function as costly windows linked by arbitrages to the deep sources of liquidity in the global crypto market. And so essentially the goal of our paper is to paint this picture, which I think more or less people have seen bits of, but we want to paint and defend this picture of this is how the market for global crypto exchanges works and why it is organized in this seemingly unusual kind of very fragmented structure. Nir, did you have a
Yeah.
question? Or?
So maybe for me, it more makes sense that the arbitrageurs and the small exchanges will be the same player in the sense that if I'm going to run an exchange that has unique customers that only can use my exchange, so in order to increase my kind of activity, I can trade with Coinbase and make the flow of the supply be better and actually do it by myself. So do you think it's
So we don't have evidence on this since the arbitrageurs, the identity of the arbitrageurs is a little difficult to get at. We have anecdotal evidence, so we've seen a couple of models. So one model, which is the version that we explicitly model in the paper, is there's literally a HFT company, and the HFT company offers liquidity. And so if you go on HFT company's website, say Wintermute, they will offer to create liquidity on exchanges. And then they'll do so under certain requirements. They'll guarantee spreads in exchange for example, some endowment of tokens or things like that. And so essentially there is evidence anecdotally that independent arbitrageurs do sometimes agree to provide liquidity for exchanges. In one case, I believe Kalshi, a prediction market exchange, has a deal with a high-frequency market maker to provide the service of market making. Why would we observe this? I think the reason we think we observe this is because the action of market making is a naturally specialized activity. And so there's a sense in which if I start an exchange, the skills required to run an exchange are not the same set of skills as the skills required to arbitrage. So a theory for why this might happen is because if you try to provide liquidity on your own exchange, you would fight against basically the market makers who are sniping you, and it becomes more efficient to make a deal with them. So then that's one theory. That said, I have chatted with one or two exchanges that do have in-house market making teams. A famous example of this, anecdotally, is that Alameda was a market maker for FTX. So in hindsight, not a very competent market maker for FTX. And then yet another model is there's actually a white labeled exchange model where there are certain exchanges, which my understanding is are essentially sort of behind the scenes, directly one of the bigger exchanges. So in the paper, we model this as literally an independent arbitrager. In reality, there's a couple different industrial organizations of how this occurs in practice to our understanding. Yeah.
I see. And sorry, another question. But in terms of your model, so it makes sense that when there is different requirements, so indeed you will see this kind of model. But if, for example, you are in a small country, so it's more likely that we will have only one exchange and not two exchanges, because then if the requirements are similar, so it doesn't make sense to have two providers, right? So in that sense, the cannibalism idea going to work and only one will stay and all the small ones that want to join will kick out, right?
Yeah, so I think this theory predicts essentially liquidity begets liquidity effects within the set of captive customer bases. So this may be countries within countries to the extent that there's other barriers creating captivity, like offering derivatives, like advertising and so on. You may be able to sustain more than one exchange. But essentially, this theory predicts that why we see so many is because there are clusters of captive customers within which you might see substitution reasonably, but across which you essentially you see this difficulty of customer substitution and arbitrage links. Yeah.
Hey, Anthony, do you have a sense of like how hard it is to perform this arbitrage and how it differs across countries? I mean,
Oh, sorry, go on. Yes.
no, go ahead. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of, you've got to make transactions through multiple exchanges. I don't know, different time zones, different fees.
Yeah. So I think our view is just thinking through the logistics of this. I think our overall view is probably the fiat leg is actually harder than the crypto leg, right?
Yeah.
So then essentially the crypto leg, as you can see, is not that hard to the extent that you can withdraw and then send to another exchange. You can finish the crypto leg in like as long as it takes to send the crypto, which is like 20 seconds for Ethereum or something, right? Now the difficult part is essentially if you are buying crypto in US dollars in the US and selling crypto in Australian dollars in Australia, you have to like shift that over. So there's a fun anecdote, I think, which illustrates this, which is that like I think there was an anecdote that FTX and Alameda got started exploiting the kimchi premium, right? And then essentially you could just ship Bitcoin to Korea, Japan, and sell it and make a lot of money. And essentially the cost in that arbitrage was before the crypto market was particularly developed. They just kept getting debanked in Japan because they would keep like depositing a bunch of money in Japanese banks and trying to wire it out. And then none of the banks would like let them do that once they figured out like their explanation was we're making money because we get crypto from somewhere. And then so in a sense, what we think is while more developed nowadays, it feels like the greater barrier to doing this and why you could not reasonably well do this as a customer is that the fiat leg requires cooperating banks and like a large set of FX transfer technology, which is costly or impossible for traditional for individuals to perform. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you see this reduction in price dispersion, I guess you're going to see it's going to be the arbitrage ability is going to be heterogeneous across countries, and so
Yes. Yeah.
yeah.
So we have an implicit test of that where in our model, we say, suppose arbitrage is more costly between two countries, right? And then the model predicts basically, we don't have a measure of that, but what we do have is that if you think that is a source of variation, the various effects should move together. Some exchanges, which are less tethered by arbitrage, should have smaller volume increases and less tendency to follow Binance because of the fact that arbitrage is more costly. So that we do see in the data, which is that the three tendencies you would expect, how linked by arbitrage through prices, volume pump, and listing following effect are correlated in the cross-section of exchanges. Yeah. Yeah. And then so I think some policy implications. I think goal number one of this paper is just to sort of paint a narrative of this is how we should think about crypto exchange market structure. Then we have a question of like, what do we infer from this for a set of policy implications? So I put some here, and then we have a couple others we're thinking about. Number one is that the size of the big exchanges, the relatively modest size, if you sort the exchanges, and the large number of exchanges understates the market power of the big exchanges. If Walmart, it's a difference between Walmart and a distributor. Walmart has market power when they enter a small town. However, they don't have that much market power because if they leave, other small grocery stores can pop up and offer the same service. Binance, in our view, is not Walmart. Binance is the distributor of groceries that sells groceries to every small grocery store in the small town. The ability of the grocery store to sell stuff depends on Binance in our model offering the token for sale and arbitrageurs providing that to the store. And so Binance looks in a substitutes world like they could easily be taken over by other exchanges, but our view suggests that in fact their role is very difficult for small exchanges to supplement because of the fact that they are the liquidity hub that all the small exchanges rely on, right? Small exchanges have an easier time offering the token if their liquidity is ultimately sourced from Binance, right? And then the other thing that we highlight is essentially that this market structure involves in the light, the exchanges that we can see, the volumes that we can see. But ultimately, like, who is really providing the liquidity? There is another set of important players in the shadows, which is the arbitrageurs. This is a joint relationship between a set of exchanges and a set of arbitrageurs shuffling stuff between exchanges. And the funny thing is that while these are not emphasized, you can see these guys on the blockchain. And in the revision of the paper, we've gathered this data and we can see what the arbitrageurs do. And what we think is that this is an important policy implication because like from either perspective, whether you are pro or anti-crypto, you have 2 points of regulation. You can regulate by targeting the exchanges and you can also regulate by targeting the arbitrageurs. So from the arbitrageurs perspective, what you can do is if you are pro-crypto, make it easy to ship crypto into your country and into your exchanges through arbitrage. If you are anti-crypto, make it impossible to do that. And then so essentially sort of there's a second target point that regulatory enforcement can try and address, which is figure out, which you can see through the on-chain flows, who is shipping the crypto into your country and decide whether you like that happening or not, and then make it easier or harder for these arbitrageurs to do it. So that's what we try to do. We are related to a emerging literature on crypto exchanges, some earlier literature on the Binance listing pump effect, and then a broader literature on crypto and decentralized finance. This needs a bit of an update. Sorry for the slightly outdated slide. So I'm going to talk through institutional background, stylized facts, and then some tests of the model. For our purposes, right, crypto exchanges allow people to buy and sell fiat for crypto. Why would we trade crypto? Because we think Bitcoin is a store of value, because we think Bitcoin is a store of value that dodges capital controls, inflation, so on. For our purposes, we don't care that much. And so a thing to note is basically that sort of these guys have a larger role than exchanges for traditional assets because they tend to bundle custody, onboarding, offboarding. They tend to be vertically integrated. They produce their own applications, so on and so forth, right? So they play a relatively large role, right? So this kind of depends, like, I think, wanting to understand these in a sense, like, while not purely a DeFi entity, the role of exchanges is much larger and much more vertically integrated than the role of exchanges for traditional financial assets. There's a lot of crypto exchanges. They mostly trade the same assets. I've kind of talked about this. Okay. So then we have open high-low close volume data, so price and volume data from cryptotick.com. There's a couple of providers. Cryptotick had good pricing for the data that we wanted. So we have 260 exchanges and 12,000 coins. A note on Cryptotick, if you do research on this, their data quality for a more recent period, I think is overall okay with some issues. The main benefit of this data set is that they cover a lot of exchanges. So a lot of the other providers will cover maybe like a couple dozen exchanges, and then sort of these guys have the long tail of exchanges, which for the purpose of our paper is quite useful. So we restrict to top 500 coins. And then our main designs basically look at what happens after a central exchange lists a coin. So we're going to treat the two largest exchanges as present, Binance and Coinbase, as large. So our stylized facts look at what happens when a large exchange lists a token, right? And then we're going to show that incumbent exchanges who have already listed the token are going to increase trade volume. Small exchanges which haven't listed have increased propensity to list, and token dispersion across small exchanges decreases. Nir, did you have a
Yeah. So your data was before Bitcoin ETF, right?
Yes, I believe. We recently updated it, but we don't have the new results yet. Yeah.
So in your setting, what is the role of the ETF? Because it's also going to have a kind of impact in that terms.
So Bitcoin ETF is not going to affect us that much because Bitcoin is not in our design because of the fact that we're going to look at listings of tokens and everyone has listed Bitcoin already. So essentially what we're looking at is small coins, mostly, with some exceptions I'll mention. So in that sense, this is not going to affect us. What will affect us is the ability to buy small tokens in ways other than these exchanges is a set of competitors to these exchanges that we didn't consider. My understanding is the set of cryptos that you can buy on Robinhood and other such exchanges is smaller than the set of long tail cryptos you can buy on these exchanges. I think an important set of competitors we haven't looked at are AMMs, where essentially like the liquidity actually happens first on Uniswap before you can even buy these on Binance. So I think that's an omission that we should, in theory, try to address. I'm not as worried about the large players because my rough understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the PayPal, Robinhood, ETF kind of competitors are focused on the big assets, and those are not the main focuses of our empirical design. Yeah.
I see. So what you say, so you're thinking more about the
Our design looks at when Binance lists, say, Olympus, then peripheral small exchanges who have already listed experience volume increases, and then they become more likely to list Olympus. Because of the nature of our listing designs, we can only analyze coins that are listed within our sample, which by definition are smaller coins than the big players. Yeah.
I see. So yeah, and what you're missing is the kind of people that use AMM for initial coin offers when they create a liquidity pool with two tokens. And
yes, yeah. So then those are another set of competitors in this market that we don't look at.
Yeah, okay. Fair game.
So then we do some pretty simple designs, which is that we do listing diff and diffs, right? So we say, suppose that a coin is listed by Binance, what happens to trade volume of that coin relative to control coins, right? And so because we have coin exchange day level data, we get a variety of controls. We get to control for other coins on the same exchange. We get a control, or we get a control for other coins on the same exchange, time fixed effects, and so on, right? And then so we're going to add various patterns of fixed effects. And what we find is that after Binance or Coinbase lists, what you see is that volume on other exchanges happens to, or volume of the coin on exchanges which have listed the coin spikes and decays. So you see this effect is somewhat short run, right? And then so you can imagine that this is driven by, for example, a sort of flurry of interest and trading volume. However, there seems to be a persistent long run effect, right? We can run this in, okay. So for listing following, if exchanges know this is going to happen, that there's persistently higher trade volume after a central exchange has listed, and they care about trade volume because they charge fees rationally, they should be more likely to list after Binance and Coinbase list, right? Indeed, that is what happens. So if we run a coin level diff and diff, where we use as y variable the number of exchanges that have listed the coin, we also see this is significant in regressions, but the diff and diff plots are slightly less nice, that the number of exchanges listing a coin increases after Binance or Coinbase listed. Finally, for price dispersion, what we see is that if we run a coin level regression of price dispersion across peripheral exchanges, Binance and Coinbase of prices of the coin across exchanges to decrease, right? And so these are, we have regression tables in the paper, but these are the three stylized facts that inform our analysis. I highlight again, I think I mentioned this, but essentially what is kind of surprising about these facts essentially is that you could not get these out of a standard competition model, right? The fact that the peripheral exchanges view Binance listing as a good thing rather than a bad thing is a strong indication that the small exchanges do not view Binance as a competitor. The fact that they experience higher volume after Binance lists is another sign, essentially, that the interaction between these is not competitors competing over a fixed market share. Yeah, it's there. Yeah.
So do you also see a trend in the, I don't know, the price difference, the spread in, starting from when one of the biggest exchanges start listing a token, and then the smaller ones, the periphery ones, adopt it? Is there a bigger opportunity for arbitrage, or is it correlated in any way?
So if we look at this, and we made another version of this plot, just looking at the P75, P25, I believe there is one plot in our paper that in the first day or two, you see a slight vol spike. And I think there is volatility generated by the listing, right? So the Binance listing pump effect where the price goes up. So I think a narrative for that is that, yeah, there's like high vol in the kind of like high activity period, but the persistent long run effect seems to be lower price dispersion. Yeah, so I think exactly as you predict, there's a bit of a short run increase in vol effect. Yeah. This is not visible here. I think we have another plot in the paper. In Coinbase, you kind of see it here. I think we have another plot in the paper where in reduced form, you do see that effect. Yeah.
So in some sense, if all exchanges use the same price oracle, or had to give their customers the best price no matter where the exchange happens, something like what exists in the capital markets, would that drastically change the behavior we're seeing?
Let me maybe sort of preview the model to give sort of argument for what I think is going on. So I'll go through the model in detail later. But just to give a picture of what I think is going on, essentially in my picture of the model, what happens is that if you have a peripheral exchange, say you're in Australia and more people want to buy Maker than sell, essentially physically the only way for that to happen, if we make an analogy, say to the gold market, right? Suppose that people in Australia want to buy gold. Somebody has to do the job of sending the gold to Australia from somewhere else and selling it to Australians. And that person has to be paid something. And so essentially, sort of arbitrageurs play an important role in the gold market by essentially getting paid to fix supply-demand imbalances. So I guess like my answer to that question would be, I want to draw an analogy to the gold market in the sense of basically like, it would be better for the world if the Australians could all buy at the Binance price, but that is an impossibility because of the fact that Binance doesn't take Australian dollars. There is functionally a physical transportation cost that somebody has to bear the transportation cost less than the gold market, but of like taking the Australian dollars and converting them to US dollars. So essentially our picture is the ARB does the job of shipping Bitcoins to Australia when Australia wants them and gets paid for them. That paid a lot of money back when Sam Bankman-Fried was doing it, and it pays less now. But essentially in the market structure where there's real physical transportation costs and BBO and stuff, what you would do in the US equity market cannot be done logistically. And the arbitrageurs essentially get paid a spread for doing that. And I guess like another thing to talk about, I forget the exact summary stats, but I think even for the small tokens, the price dispersion we're seeing is not more than 1 to 200 basis points, I think, even in relatively extreme cases. And then so sort of one way to say it is that the effective spreads that are charged by the arbitrageurs are high relative to traditional finance, but sort of not in the sort of impossibly high range. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, thanks for the question. As I think that really illustrates like the picture we want to paint of like the arbitrageurs are doing a real job and getting paid for it. Yeah.
Just to clarify, it's even that in the data you showed like Binance and Coinbase, but it also work if you have a coin that launch in Coinbase. So Binance also will take some liquidity from Coinbase, right? It's can also work from.
So in our empirical design, we're using a we're using two hubs, right? And then so the question is basically we're not modeling the interaction with the two hubs. So we're a little bit kind of like sort of like not totally modeling the whole thing, right? Where like there's a star, like the best way to think about it is there's a star around Binance and there's a star around Coinbase. Obviously not true in reality. We're going to use that as an approximation.
Yeah, but I think like in general, in theory, I think it's also should hold between hubs, right? Because
I think we drop Binance when looking at Coinbase and vice versa. So our identification is coming from the small exchanges at the moment. In theory, we could do that. Yeah, I don't think you don't have enough power to get that in statistical significance because testing like A follows B with is a little bit like I don't have a good control if I try and estimate Coinbase's effect on Binance and vice versa. Yeah.
But I feel like it's kind of a win-win for both of them, I feel, because if one of
So
them.
I guess what I'm saying is I think it's probably happening. I just don't have a good way to convincingly show it with good standard errors. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. So I'll briefly talk about the model. Essentially, our model has the following. We want to construct a model that, again, you can think of basically as, think of the gold market, the worldwide gold market. And then sort of that's, I think, a good analogy. We have a bunch of peripheral exchanges we assume have perfectly captive customer bases. And then the peripheral exchange customers trade the token due to idiosyncratic liquidity shocks. Limits to arbitrage imply that liquidity shocks move prices. When the central exchange lists, we can get the three effects. Peripheral exchange volume increases because of arbitrage volume. Anticipating higher profits, peripheral exchanges are more likely to list, and price dispersion decreases. So there's a single risky asset in the model, and there's 4 kinds of agents. Central exchanges we assume to be perfectly deep. Peripheral exchanges are finitely deep with a captive customer base. There are customers, and there are arbitrageurs subject to an inventory cost. And so an illustration of the model, I won't go through the math, is essentially the following. You have some people who receive positive inventory shocks or demand shocks and want to sell, some people who receive negative inventory shocks and want to buy. So if we look at this picture, essentially the good situation is where you have 2 people who want to buy and then 2 people who want to sell, and then these guys just sell to these people. This doesn't always happen, of course. What happens is sometimes that there will be more natural buying demand than natural selling demand. And then what happens when you don't have a central exchange is that this cannot happen, markets cannot clear. So instead what happens is that the price rises. When the price rises, more people want to sell and less people want to buy. So one buyer disappears and one seller appears, and then markets clear. So demand shocks in the absence of arbitrage, linking them to central liquidity, generate shifts in prices, increasing price dispersion, but cannot generate volume because markets must clear, right? And then very simply what happens is that if you have arbitrageurs linking these exchanges to central exchanges with deeper liquidity, then what happens is that you can have imbalanced markets where what's going to happen is that if there's net buying demand, the arbitrager simply buys from the central exchange and ships that in and becomes a seller. And so instead of a market in autarky where buyers and sellers markets must clear within this peripheral exchange, in response to supply and demand imbalances, the arbitrager simply buys and sells quantity from the central exchange and ships it into the peripheral exchange. And the result is very simple. Prices equalize, and demand shocks result in quantity flows rather than price change. And so we immediately get the results that we want, which is number 1, central exchange entry should increase volumes because these demand shocks turn into arbitrage flow, which is increased volume, which the peripheral exchange can collect fees on, right? Number 2, the peripheral exchanges know this. They know that if the central exchange is there, they have a source of liquidity, they can get more volume, they're more likely to list. And prediction 3, because of the fact that the central exchange offers liquidity to the peripheral exchange, the entry of the central exchange should decrease price dispersion on peripheral exchanges. One thing I'll mention is that an awkward feature of this model is basically that we assumed an infinitely deep central exchange. We're revising the paper, and then we managed to fix this. So then we have a first stage in the revision where we actually have a network formation game where we can show that the central exchange can endogenously emerge. So if you just assume there's a bunch of identical exchanges, they naturally form a star under the actions of arbitrages. So in hopefully a month or two, we'll have a revision where we essentially get to extend this model a bit by microfounding the emergence of the central exchange. Yeah. So maybe a quick word on the revision. Essentially, the story we want to tell in the revision extends this story a tiny bit, essentially by saying the central exchange is not by nature infinitely deep. Binance is not born to be infinitely deep. Binance is deep partly because it's central. It emerges as central because of the fact that everyone links to it. So Binance is deep partly because everyone else in the world is is linked to Binance. And so essentially, like, Binance ships quantity into one peripheral exchange by sourcing the quantity implicitly from every other peripheral exchange. So then we have a slightly new emergence of centrality idea that will hopefully come out in a few months. Yeah.
Anthony, sorry, just quickly. Are you saying that because it seems in reality there's reasons why Binance starts sort of where it does and becomes large, and then the peripheral ones, join on for the reasons you said. Are you saying in a model where all the exchanges are identical, you still end up with a star
Correct.
network?
We can get that under some parameter restrictions. And then how that happens is quite simple. It's liquidity begets liquidity, because we can find conditions under which arbitrageurs, knowing that all the other arbitrageurs link to a central exchange, find it optimal to also go to that central exchange. So the story we want to tell here, again, is like inspired by, say, agricultural commodity markets, right? Like, Chicago is a hub for wheat. And what a hub means is that sort of if you have wheat to buy or sell, you go to Chicago because you know everyone else coordinate on it. So this differs from the standard customer liquidity begets liquidity, because instead of customers going to the exchange and sort of generating one giant exchange, here's a story where you have natural local towns with their local wheat markets and arbitrageurs who realize that this town has too much wheat and I need to figure out how to take it. And then the arbitrageurs play a game where eventually they decide we're all going to go to Chicago. So then we took that game, we solved it. Sometimes it doesn't admit a star equilibrium, but sometimes it does. And then so now we have a model which basically tells that story of I can get Binance to be big purely based on coordination and not based on its fundamental bigness. Yeah. And then so in the revision, we're emphasizing that angle. Yeah.
Thank you.
And then so we have a couple tests that point at the arbitrage mechanism. So there's a clear alternative hypothesis, which is basically that when Binance lists, everyone gets very excited, and then basically volumes increase just because everyone's very excited, right? So then in the revision, we're doing a little more here, but at the to begin with, we have some evidence that suggests at least the arbitrage mechanism plays some role. So we're going to do a little better in the revision, where we can argue that the role that the arbitrage panel plays seems to be quantitatively large, but for now we have qualitative evidence. And so the qualitative evidence is we see the star structure of price correlations. So peripheral exchanges are more correlated with the central exchange than with each other. And then secondly, which I mentioned before, the features across exchanges seem correlated with each other. So essentially higher price correlations are associated with stronger volume increases and listing follow. So here's the price correlation. Under our theory, Binance is a hub, and everyone's price is Binance plus noise because everyone is linked to Binance by arbitrage, right? And then in this model, what should happen is that the R squared between this and Binance should be higher than the R squared between arbitrary pair of peripheral exchanges. Indeed, we find this. So we draw the CDFs of pairs of R squares between pairs of prices. And what we find is basically that the correlations are higher for peripheral exchanges and Binance or Coinbase, so these lines, than peripheral exchanges with each other, right? And then so what does this say? This says basically that the average R squared between a exchange and Binance Coinbase is higher than the average R squared between two peripheral exchanges. So at some level, this is sort of, you would expect this, right? It makes sense that price discovery happens on Binance and exchanges are Binance plus noise, right? And sort of we point to this just as evidence that like, this is evidence suggesting that sort of the price discovery happens on some central exchanges. It looks like the other exchanges are those big exchanges plus some noise. And then secondly, we're going to test this hypothesis, which says that there is one parameter, which is one parameter we cannot observe, but that parameter is how closely I'm linked to Binance or Coinbase by arbitrage, and that drives outcomes, right? So what does that predict? It predicts that if you're more tightly tied to Binance and Coinbase by arbitrage, volume responses to listing effects should be bigger, right? And then what you see is indeed, if I sort the exchanges by their price correlation with Binance and Coinbase, the more correlated an exchange's prices is with Binance, the more the volume increases, red versus blue, when Binance lists, right? And then so this is not mechanical in the sense that there's no particular reason that higher price correlation should lead this diff and diff to have a larger volume effect, right? And then so I think on both sides, the effect seems to suggest basically that there's some exchanges which are less linked by arbitrage, which have less volume pump effects. There are some exchanges which are more linked by arbitrage, which have higher volume pump effects. Likewise, the listing following effect is stronger for more correlated exchanges, suggesting that peripheral exchanges who rely more on Binance for liquidity and thus have higher correlation of prices with Binance also have a higher propensity to follow Binance listing decisions, to list a token after Binance lists.
Can I, sorry,
Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
something about the star network. So something that I'm a little bit confused is that there is regulations that on paper, if they works well, also can create that there is no direct star connection, because it could be that arbitrageurs can't really have a direct connection between small exchange to Coinbase, because Coinbase has some regulation that doesn't going to expect. Or for example, imagine about DeFi. If you want to add a DeFi as a star to the network, the problem with DeFi is if you can't transfer your Bitcoin from DeFi to Coinbase, then we have kind of a regulation issue. So what do you think in that case? How the market will solve it? I guess the way to solve it is to manipulate the regulation and find a creative way to put your Bitcoin in Coinbase, even though it went in a.
So I think my model is going to take a very stylized stance that all the exchanges are identical and there's no arbitrage barriers. So in that model, what happens is everyone connects literally to the star network. There's of course a possibility that there are some exchanges which basically for various kinds of regulation cannot directly connect to the star network, right? And then you would then expect some kind of like two-step model where essentially you first arbitrage to there and then here. I guess another thing which like if you had a more realistic model of like say agricultural commodities, you could have a kind of fractal star emerging where essentially small towns, right, have their like local small market, and then like the slightly bigger village market goes into like a national market and stuff like that. So I think like a direction one could go taking this seriously is to think of the emergence of fractal like markets. And our new model, I think, in theory, if you put down transport costs, can handle models like that. In the simpler case of crypto, where I think rather than transport costs, you basically have this guy cannot connect to Binance. You would like we have not solved this, but you would guess that this just links to someone who then links to the star. We're gonna abstract away from that and say everyone's the same, and then they form a star network. Yeah.
And DeFi, you see, can.
Can I?
Sorry.
Yeah, just like, so how you see like DeFi can connect to this network?
It's not so. In talking with some people who do MEV arbitrage, my understanding is that they do do this because like, what is an arbitrage? What an arbitrage is Uniswap is like that, and then Binance has a price. And if the Uniswap price diverges, like I just buy here and then sell there, and I can work out the transfers later, right? As if I buy here and sell there, I've locked in the price already, right? I can kind of do the transfer slowly over time. Like my profit is locked in at the point where I've bought some USDC ETH at a certain price on Uniswap, and then I've sold the same amount at Binance. The rest is just settlement. Yeah. So I guess I disagree. I think like in many cases, I can actually directly arb Uniswap against Binance. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? So here, with the higher price correlation, it probably means that on that, you get a lower fee because of the fee band. It's easier to arb so that you have a higher price correlations. but how do we tell the volume increase? It's not due to it has lower fees.
I think that could explain. Let me think about this a bit. I see. And then if there's a higher fee, there would also be a higher propensity to follow listings because your incentive is stronger. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think because we have the fees and we could control for that. So I think we should control for that. Thanks for that suggestion. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a very good idea. Okay, so I'm pretty much out of time. I want to talk about one other thing, which is that sort of one policy implication is that when Binance lists a token, volume increases on Binance, and volume also increases everywhere else, and everyone else also follows Binance. And so the thing is that, like, if you just measure the effect of Binance on market outcomes, by how much direct effect there is, you understate the influence of the central exchanges on market outcomes. Because you have to also account for the fact that the effects on other exchanges, both listing and conditional on listing, are positive. And so we essentially ran some diff and dis to illustrate this effect. What this shows is that when Binance lists a token, they generate this much fundamental volume on Binance themselves. They generate a substantial amount of volume on other exchanges and a substantial amount of volume due to entry. And likewise for Coinbase. And so what we find essentially is that for Coinbase, actually, the second order effects of inducing entry of new exchanges and then increasing the volume on other exchanges that listed the coin are actually larger than Coinbase's direct effect. In Binance's case, what we find is Binance's direct effect is larger, but essentially there's a kind of leverage effect where Coinbase affects outcomes much more than you would guess just by its effect on itself. So I will wrap up by saying essentially that, yeah, we tried to paint this picture of this is how the market for crypto exchange works. This is policy implications and thinking basically about sort of what is the role of these small exchanges? And if I want to regulate outcomes in different markets, what is the approach to effectively doing that? So yeah, so I'll stop there if there are any other questions.
Thank you so much. Super interesting. So if someone has a question, feel free.
Yeah, I'll ask, the computer scientist in the call. What can technology, if you could wish for something, what could technology do? And how can technology help?
So I think what is interesting about this market structure is that we thought about this and then we found something very interesting, which is like, this market looks kind of like wheat markets in what you would imagine like medieval Europe to look like, right? And it's like, why in the world is the most technologically advanced globalized market look like that? And the reason we think is because of the unique features of crypto as an asset. Like US stocks are legal fictions existing in the US. And so they naturally trade on one or a couple US exchanges. And essentially, it does not make sense to trade US stocks outside the US, like logistically, because they're a US legal fiction. The nature of crypto, which is crypto lives on the internet and on a ledger, which is decentralized, implies that essentially sort of you have transportation costs because of the fact that everyone owns crypto on one ledger. But when you want to trade crypto for various things, you trade it for different kinds of fiat, right? And so the kind of interesting conclusion is that you end up with a market that looks like medieval European wheat markets because of the fact that crypto is internationalized, but fiat is not. And then so a path to making this, if you thought that we would like everyone to trade in a liquid market, the solution is just to never get into fiat in the first place, which is a bit ridiculous. But the thing is, the way to do that is if everyone actually uses stable coins, right? And everyone, as is happening on some exchanges, is basically trading crypto against stables. Then everyone can just trade on the same exchange, right? So if you go all the way to the limit of basically all financial assets are on this thing, the problem is the fiat. The crypto is great, right? If we were all on crypto all the time, we would not need all these bridges. The bridges to fiat are the problem. So I think that would be my take on that.
I mean, I love it. Aren't you quoting the original Bitcoin paper, white paper right now?
I think so. No,
I mean,
I agree.
essentially, this is what Bitcoin created.
No, exactly.
We wanted to create a global Rails system that lives in its own virtual world, and everybody accepts, and you have merchants and users and everybody just using Bitcoin, and there's no fiat and there's no government.
No, precisely. And I think sort of it took us a long time to actually realize this implication, because we thought, like, why does this market structure happen? And what we ended up realizing is that this is the intersection of a completely international, successfully internationalized crypto system with a bunch of legacy fiat systems that are not. And essentially, sort of what makes the crypto exchanges segmented in the end is the fact that the crypto exchange is the bridge between the not internationalized traditional financial system and the internationalized crypto financial system. Uniswap is not all that segmented. There is the effect that the winner ends up taking a large share of the pie because of the fact that it doesn't face this issue. Everyone in the world trades on the same Uniswap. And so it took us a while to realize that, but I think we agree with that. Yeah, essentially, like, crypto succeeded, fiat did not, and that is what results in this like border market structure being weird. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, we can take. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting. I mean, of course, yeah. I mean, that's such a big conceptually. That's such a big idea, though, right? I mean, we have. I mean, there's an old literature, Mundell, on global currency zones. There's reasons why we don't just have one currency. But it certainly, I definitely agree with your point that if transactions, if people are willing to hold their value in stable coins, then this problem
Yeah, and I
disappears.
think, to be clear, I'm not saying whether that's a good or bad thing. Just sort of, I think our goal is to explain like the primitives that lead to this being an outcome. And I think the primitives that we want to highlight that I think are underappreciated is, I think, what some people had maybe abstracted away as just something that's ignorable is the lack of interoperability of fiat and regulatory jurisdictions. Like, I think this is not something perhaps in this discussion that's often thought about. And it seems to us that, I guess, a stance we're taking is the only real thing that can justify the emergence of weird segmented market structure when naturally the economic forces in exchanges are for centralization is these things must be playing a very large role in determining market structure.
Yeah. But I think that point also comes up even in conventional payment, like even in cross-border payments. I mean,
Right.
these issues come up that when you want to make a cross-border payment from one country to another, or if you even go through a vehicle currency, you've got to cross multiple regulatory perimeters, and this is complicated. And I do think in the traditional world, finance world, they're regulators are working to try and
I think, like,
smooth out these
I think
issues.
why this shows up this way is because I think in crypto on chain, everyone is using stablecoins to trade the same assets. In fiat off chain, the US guys are using US dollars to trade US stocks most of the time. Where the weirdness of this emerges is that sort of everyone is working in their own fiat, but everyone is trading the same crypto. So essentially, this is the only market where basically sort of, unlike in TradFi, you're using Rails, but you're also trading segmented financial assets. Like,
Yeah.
this is the only asset class you see this, because more or less, this is the only asset class where everyone is actually trading literally the same. Like, you trade US stocks from China, you're buying ADRs using US dollars custodially held in a bank somewhere. So you don't see this market structure emerging because you are buying US stocks through an entity that exists in the US that acts as a US person. And so sort of, in a sense, like, because we face the question of, like, what other assets have this structure, why or why not? And then we thought carefully and realized nothing. And then why nothing is because essentially you never have this dual feature of people are buying using their own fiat, but they're not buying assets that live in the localized regulatory system of their own country.